wife. She died on this land before I could bring her home.
You could have refused me.
Her father gave her to a cowboy sheriff because she was cursed, but he loved her like no other man. Ayanna did not cry the day her father traded her to the cowboy sheriff. It was not courage that kept her eyes dry, but the fact that shame had already burned her tear ducts empty years before. She stood as still as a cut of wood, while the red dust swirled around her ankles, her thin buckskin tunic clinging to her wiry frame. Her long, black braids fell like shadows across her face, the face her own people, the Cheyenne, had come to call Stormbringer. To them, she was not a daughter of the people anymore, but a warning, a curse, something to be bartered away like an unwanted horse. Her father's voice was hard and unyielding, his words slicing like the prairie wind. She's skilled, doesn't complain. And our people cannot risk another storm, he declared, his eyes refusing to rest on hers. The men gathered around nodded, as if the matter was already decided. To them, Ayanna was not flesh and blood. She was an object to be moved, exchanged, discarded. Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second, and tell us where you're watching from if you love Wild West love stories. Your voice keeps these tales alive. Sheriff Wyatt Kane said nothing. He stood broad-shouldered in the fading sun, silent as stone, his worn hat casting a shadow across his eyes. When the bargain ended, he tossed down a small leather pouch, the dull clink of gold dust inside, and laid a new rifle across the ground. The trade was sealed. Ayanna did not understand the white man's customs, but she knew enough to grasp this. She was not being stolen. She was being given away, offered up like a bad omen her people longed to be rid of. That kind of rejection, especially when it comes from blood, burns deeper than any lash. She expected shackles, ropes, or to be dragged off like the prisoner she had become. But Wyatt did none of those things. He simply handed her a canteen of water and gestured toward his horse. His hand moved with something that looked almost gentle, a movement Ayanna had not witnessed in years. Without words, he set off down the trail, his boots heavy against the red earth, his horse stepping in rhythm. She followed, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. Her feet dragged across the dirt, and her mind circled like vultures above a dying beast. She thought of the whispers of children who called her cursed, of women who turned their backs when she walked near, of elders who muttered she had brought storms upon the village. Even her younger brother, Running Wolf, had taken to mocking her in secret, calling her Crowheart when their father was not listening. And now the final confirmation: she was given away like nothing. With every mile deeper into the Redstone Desert, the silence between her and Wyatt grew heavy. Yet, in that silence, something unfamiliar stirred inside her chest. It was not hope, not even fear. It was sharper, like a blade. It was the dawning realization that she had left behind everyone who had ever told her she was unworthy of love. The land itself mirrored her emptiness, vast, wind-battered, unending. The desert stretched in all directions like a blank canvas, and she thought, in some distant corner of her soul, maybe here, in this emptiness, she could paint herself anew. At sunset, they reached a clearing by a jagged creek. Wyatt stopped. He dismounted, tied his horse, and looked at her. Not past her, not through her, but at her. The quiet in his gaze unnerved her more than threats or orders ever could. She clutched the canteen close, its leather warm from the day's heat. Her voice cracked as if unused for seasons. "Why didn't you say anything?" Her whisper drifted across the clearing like smoke. Wyatt didn't reply. Instead, he knelt and began to gather sticks, striking flint until a fire sparked to life. Not for command, not to intimidate, simply for warmth. Something in Ayanna's chest, something coiled and frozen for too long, shifted. She had expected rough hands, a barked command in a tongue she barely understood, the treatment of a man who had purchased her. Instead, she awoke at dawn to the smell of coffee bubbling in a tin and the sound of water rushing beyond the camp. A thick wool blanket lay across her shoulders, placed there in the night. Wyatt was already at the creek, kneeling, polishing his Winchester rifle with steady, practiced hands. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man who trusted time to be on his side. When he glanced up and caught her watching, he did not command her to rise or look away. He simply nodded once, as though acknowledging her presence was enough. It unsettled her. It made her ashamed of how her chest warmed at the first flicker of human decency she had known in years. As they journeyed deeper into the hills, Ayanna began to notice how the settlers looked at Wyatt when they passed through small outposts, some with respect, others with quiet fear. He carried weight, this man. His silence was not weakness, but gravity, drawing eyes and whispers. And yet with her, his silences carried no cruelty. When she stumbled while crossing a shallow stream, he reached out, catching her arm firmly, but not harshly. His hand steadied her, and in that moment, something hot stung her eyes. Not pain, something far more dangerous. Tenderness. That night, Wyatt handed her a small tin salve. He motioned toward her blistered feet. She blinked, uncomprehending. "Helps the trail," he murmured at last, his voice gravelly, low, not unkind. The salve burned at first, then cooled her raw skin, and Ayanna, for the first time since childhood, wept, not from humiliation, not from rejection, but from the sheer shock of being treated as though she had worth. The sobs came silent at first, then rough and sharp, breaking her chest open. She turned away, clutching herself under the wool blanket, terrified he would mock her or command her to silence. But Wyatt said nothing. He let her tears fall, the fire between them crackling softly, his presence steady as stone. She didn't know what she was to him. Not a wife, not in the way her people defined it. Not a slave, either. Something else she could not name. As the stars wheeled above them cold and endless, Ayanna felt a strange, unsteady thing take root inside her heart. It was not love, not yet. It was recognition, and for the first time in her 20 years, she felt seen. The days grew warmer, and the roughness of the path carved its way into their bones. Yet strangely, Ayanna's legs grew steadier with each passing mile. The first mornings had been agony, her feet raw, her breath burning, her body trembling as if the earth itself wanted her to collapse. But by the end of the first week, she no longer stumbled in Wyatt's shadow. She walked beside him now, her steps more certain, her body hardened by necessity. Sometimes she walked so close she could catch the faint scent of pine smoke clinging to his jacket, mingled with the sharper tang of leather. Other times she lagged just behind, watching how he moved, steady and assured, as though the land itself breathed with him, trusted him, and parted its dangers in deference to his stride. She didn't speak much. Silence was still her armor, as it had been back in her village where every word had been twisted into a weapon. She wasn't even sure if she was allowed to speak, but Wyatt had begun, in his slow, deliberate way, pointing out herbs growing by the trail, naming landmarks in his low, measured voice, showing her which desert plants could heal and which could kill. His words were not lessons exactly. He did not order her to learn, but they fell into her ears like seeds, and something inside her soil, barren for so long, began to stir. One afternoon, they passed beneath a ridge of red stone, the sunlight sliding down its face like molten fire. From the other side of the bend, a rider appeared, a young cowboy with restless eyes and arrogance stitched into the way he sat his horse. His pistol rode low on his hip, polished as if he wanted the world to see it. The boy's words were quick, his tone mocking, his gaze darting between Ayanna and Wyatt, with a smirk that needed no translation. Ayanna did not understand every syllable, but she knew the language of cruelty well enough, the upward tilt of the chin, the sly half-laugh, the question implied with a glance toward her body. The boy's ugly laughter cut sharp as flint. Then he spurred his horse and disappeared in a cloud of dust, his jeer echoing long after he was gone. Wyatt had not flinched. He did not answer, did not curse, did not threaten. He only stood a moment, his jaw tight beneath the brim of his hat, before turning back to the trail. That silence weighed heavier on Ayanna's chest than shouting would have. That night, as they camped beneath a ledge where the stars spilled across the heavens like broken glass, Ayanna's voice cracked free at last. She sat close to the fire, her knees pulled to her chest, and asked, "Do they think I'm your punishment?" Her words wavered, fragile as smoke. Wyatt's eyes, deep and shadowed, lingered on her face. For a long moment, the fire popped between them, and he said nothing. Then he reached into his satchel, pulled out a small, worn photograph, and placed it in her hands. "My wife," he said slowly, each word thick as gravel. "She never came back. She died on this land before I could bring her home." The photograph was faded, the corners worn soft. A woman's face, distant yet gentle, stared back at Ayanna from the ghost of time. The smooth paper fit her palm as though it had been waiting for her touch all along. Her throat tightened. Something inside her, bitter and corroded for years, cracked. "You could have refused me," she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. Wyatt's voice came steady, quiet as a prayer. "Your eyes were sad. I do not turn away sadness." That night, Ayanna held the photograph close to the firelight. She did not feel pretty, her tunic torn, her hair tangled with dust, her body weary. But for the first time, she felt that perhaps being called Stormbringer was never the true reason she had been unwanted. Maybe no one had known how to look at her. Maybe no one had known how to see. The first time she laughed, it startled them both. She had been gathering firewood when she tripped on a root, landing in an ungainly sprawl among a patch of wildflowers blooming stubbornly in the desert dust. Twigs tangled in her braids, petals crushed against her knees. She looked up to see Wyatt standing there, a crooked grin ghosting across his usually solemn mouth. Something absurd struck her then, the image of herself, the bartered girl, sprawled in flowers, her hair a mess, and him, the silent sheriff, trying not to smile. It broke through her ribs in a sharp, clear laugh that rang against the canyon walls. It was so sudden and pure that she startled herself. For a long second, Wyatt just stared. Then, slowly, a deep, low laugh rumbled from his chest. Not loud, not long, but real. The sound wrapped around her like warmth she had never known. Something shifted between them, as if the air itself bent to make space for it. In the days that followed, their silences grew softer, more companionable. Ayanna began to mimic his hand signs for water, fire, and food, her lips fumbling at first, then forming shapes more certain. Each time she managed one, Wyatt gave a short nod, a flicker of approval that settled deep in her bones like a blessing. She felt pride in each new thing learned, as though each gesture was a thread tying her to life again. One evening, as she sat beside him cleaning a rifle he had hunted with, Wyatt's gaze rested on her hands. After a long pause, he said simply, "You are not weak." It was not a compliment in the way men usually gave, but it struck her harder than any flattery, because it was truth. Truth she had never been allowed to believe. Peace, however, is fragile in a world stitched from pain. The next day, they reached a small settler village, nestled against a canyon bend. The moment they entered, Ayanna felt it, the stares, the whispers tucked behind hands, the eyes heavy with judgment. Women gawked. Children pointed. And then an elder, his beard gray as frost, approached Wyatt with clipped, hostile words. Ayanna could not catch every phrase, but she caught enough. The man did not approve of her. He did not believe she belonged. His hand slashed the air toward her, his lips curling in disgust. Wyatt's responses were calm, even. But when the elder spat on the ground at Ayanna's feet, something in her shrank. Her shoulders folded inward, her head dropped. The old habit of disappearing into herself returned like a reflex. But then, Wyatt stepped forward, his jaw locked, his voice breaking the air with a firmness she had never heard from him. The elder man actually stepped back, cowed by something in Wyatt's authority. Ayanna did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Wyatt had claimed her not as a burden, not as a punishment, but as someone worth defending. That night, camped on the village's edge, Ayanna sat near the fire, the silence between them deep. At last, her voice trembled free. "Why do you keep doing that? Standing up for me?" Wyatt stirred the fire with a stick, staring into the flames. He was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. But then his voice came, low, rough as gravel sliding down a canyon wall. "Because no one stood for my sister either," he murmured, and she broke. Ayanna looked at him. For the first time, she saw him not just the silent sheriff, not just the man who had not turned away sadness, but someone carved by his own grief, carrying the ghosts of losses too heavy for words. And in that moment, she understood. They were both remnants, both broken things discarded by others. But here, in the endless wild, their fragments were beginning to fit together. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a flood of 1 second and write your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here beneath these wide, unbroken skies. They left the village at dawn, a pale line of light crawling slowly over the rim of the canyon, chasing away the shadows that had clung too tightly through the night. Smoke from the last embers of their fire still lingered, clinging to Ayana's hair, her skin, her very breath, as though the whispers of the settlers had followed them into the wilderness. She walked with her head bowed at first, carrying the heaviness of stairs and spit, but the steady crunch of Wyatt's boots on the hard-packed trail soon pulled her gaze forward. He walked with the same calm stride as always, yet his silence was no longer cold. It was the silence of thought, not dismissal, and that difference was enough to soften the ache in her chest. For the first time, Ayana felt less like a shadow and more like a companion. She carried her own bundle of supplies slung across her back, her fingers blistered but firm on the strap. She knew how to set traps for rabbits now, had learned to distinguish the whistle of a hawk from the warning call of a coyote, could even coax sparks into flame with flint instead of waiting for his hands. Wyatt still rarely spoke, but when his eyes settled on her, something dangerous stirred inside her ribcage, not fear, but a hope so sharp and unfamiliar it frightened her. The fragile thread of that new hope was tested before noon, when the smell of blood reached them on the wind. It struck first as a faint metallic tang, then grew stronger until the land itself seemed stained with it. At the base of a ridge lay the ruins of an Apache camp. Splintered wagons lay cracked open, their wheels torn, a horse dead in its harness, others trembling with foam on their flanks. Flies gathered thick around the corpses, and the silence was so vast it screamed. Ayana froze. She had seen death before, had smelled it when bison hunts went wrong, had watched men stagger home with wounds too deep to heal, but this was different. This was massacre. Her breath caught when she spotted her. A Navajo girl, no more than 12, crouched against the remnants of a canvas wall, clutching a blood-soaked blanket to her chest. Her lips moved in broken prayers, her body rocking as though she could shake herself out of reality. Wyatt stepped forward carefully, his hands open, his voice low. But the girl's eyes widened with terror. She shrieked, her small body trembling, and in a motion both brave and desperate she snatched up a hatchet, raising it with shaking hands. "Don't touch me, white man," she screamed, her voice raw, splintering the silence. And then, spent by her own terror, she collapsed into sobs. Ayana's heart lurched. Before she could think, her feet carried her forward. She crouched low, her palms lifted. "He's not going to hurt you," she said softly, her voice trembling with both truth and plea. "I promise." But the girl's dark eyes locked on hers, confusion cutting through the fear. "You're with him?" she spat, disbelief dripping like poison. In her gaze, Ayana saw not gratitude, but betrayal. They helped her anyway. Wyatt bound the wounds on her arms with clean cloth, his movements careful, his silence gentler than words. Ayana coaxed one of the frightened horses, murmuring low until the animal's trembling slowed. By nightfall, the girl had given them her name, Luna. She no longer screamed when Wyatt moved, though her eyes never left him, suspicion carved deep into her young face. That night, Ayana sat apart from the fire, her back pressed to cold stone, shame gnawing at her ribs. The memory of Luna's accusation clung like thorns. A voice whispered in her mind, cruel and relentless. "No matter how kind he is, to them he will always be a monster. And to stand beside him makes you monstrous too." When she finally dared to ask Wyatt why he had not left Luna to die, he did not look at her. His profile was a dark line against the firelight. "Because she is alone," he said simply. His voice was low, flat, but it carried a weight that pinned her heart. "You remember what alone feels like." Ayana swallowed hard. She remembered too well the nights when even the children laughed at her back, the days when her father's eyes carried only disgust. She knew, and in that knowing, she realized something else. To walk beside Wyatt meant choosing to live by a different kind of honor, not the one etched into tribal chants or shouted in victory, but the quiet kind that revealed itself only when no one else was watching. She woke before dawn to the sound of hushed voices. Luna's whisper sliced through the morning air, sharp and trembling. "You don't understand," the girl hissed. "He's a soldier. They kill people like us." Ayanna froze, crouched behind the rocks where she had gone to fetch water. Her heart sank with each word, the weight of Luna's fear pressing into her like a stone. "He saved you," Ayanna said at last, stepping into view. Her voice was firm, though her knees trembled. "He's done nothing but treat us both better than most of our own people ever have." Luna flinched, caught, but her chin jutted defiantly. "You weren't born a warrior," she hissed. "You don't know what they've done." 1,000 memories clawed through Ayanna's mind. Her father trading her like spoiled meat, the tribe's laughter, the way she had been named Stormbringer, cursed to carry blame for every drought, every storm. Her lips trembled, but her words came steady. "No," she said quietly, "but I know what people do when they believe someone is beneath them." Luna looked away, her small shoulders shaking, but she said nothing more. When they set out again, Luna claimed she knew of an army outpost nearby. The thought twisted Ayanna's stomach. As a child, she had once dreamed of places with roofs, with order, where no one spat her name like venom. But dreams changed. Safety now looked like Wyatt's fire, not wooden fences. Still, they followed Luna's directions, Ayanna walking a little farther from Wyatt that day. Not because she doubted him, but because guilt gnawed at her guilt that part of her still feared the way others saw them together. They dragged Wyatt across the dust-packed yard toward the holding tent, rough hands on his shoulders, boots striking the ground with practiced cruelty. Yet when he lifted his head, when his gaze found hers across the chaos, what Ayanna saw there was not fear, nor anger, nor even resignation. It was strength, calm, unbroken, the same steady strength he had carried from the night they first met. And in that silent look, Ayanna understood with a clarity that struck like lightning. If she didn't fight for him now, she would become no different than her father, the man who had once traded her away as though she were nothing. The thought set fire in her chest. She stormed through the outpost like a storm cloud breaking, dust clinging to her boots, her braid heavy against her back. She did not hesitate. She pushed her way into the captain's tent, fists clenched, voice trembling but sharp as an arrow. "Why is he being held?" she demanded. The man who looked up at her did not rise. A grizzled officer with lines dug deep into his mouth, the smell of whiskey clinging to his breath as thick as smoke. His eyes were small, calculating, amused. "Because he's a soldier, miss," he drawled, slow as syrup, "and that's reason enough in these parts." Her stomach lurched. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her trembling but not with fear, with fury. The canvas walls seemed to close in, the air thick with dust and contempt. She slammed her hand down on his desk, rattling a tin cup, until liquid sloshed onto the maps scattered there. "That man saved Luna's life. He saved mine. He is no criminal." The captain leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. His eyes slid over her like she was a curiosity, nothing more. "Maybe not," he said coolly, "but we can't have him roaming free and scaring the womenfolk now, can we?" That sentence cut deeper than any blade. Something inside her snapped. For years she had bent her head, swallowed her voice, borne the shame of being unwanted. But no more. She turned on her heel before she struck him, heart racing, lungs full of fire. Outside, she found Luna seated near the fire pit, wrapped in a clean dress, sipping tea with both hands. Bandages swaddled her wounds, her face pale but softened by comfort. To look at her, one might never guess she had clutched a bloodied blanket only hours before. "Say something," Ayanna begged, the words raw. But Luna lowered her gaze, muttering into the steam of her cup. "It's better this way. You'll be safe now." Ayanna stared, stunned. The fire crackled between them. At last she whispered, her voice breaking, "You were never the one in danger." When night fell, Ayanna slipped into the holding tent. The air was thick with sweat and damp earth, the stench of rope and dust. Wyatt knelt in the dim light, his hands tied behind his back, bruises blooming purple along his jaw where fists had struck him. Yet his eyes, those unyielding, steady eyes, remained calm. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have brought you here." Wyatt shook his head slowly, his voice quiet but certain. "You needed to see." And she did see. She saw that the world she had once dreamed might redeem her. The neat fences, the ordered tents, the white men who spoke of law, was only another cage, another place where she would be small, silent, grateful for a kind of safety that came wrapped in chains. She pressed her forehead to his, tears spilling freely now, unashamed at last. "I won't let them keep you," she whispered into the hollow space between them. And he exhaled, long and low, like a man who had been holding his breath for too many years. Ayanna waited. She watched the camp sink into drunken quiet, the guards' laughter softening into snores, rifles slack in their arms. She moved then, a shadow among shadows, her heart pounding not with fear but with a strange clarity. She had nothing left to lose. The storage shed was just as she remembered. She slipped inside, the wooden boards groaning beneath her weight, and found what she needed: a rusted hatchet, a coil of rope, bolt cutters tossed carelessly by a lazy quartermaster. She tucked them beneath her shawl, each piece of stolen metal heavy with purpose. She did not feel like a rescued girl. She did not feel like a fugitive's accomplice. She felt, for the first time in her life, like herself, whole, fierce, unbroken. "If you're watching on television," she thought bitterly, as though to some unseen audience beyond the stars, "don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe so you'll never miss these stories of people who refuse to bow." Slipping into the tent, she found him waiting, silent but watchful. His eyes followed her as she knelt, as she drew the bolt cutters from beneath her shawl. She snapped the chain from his wrists in one decisive motion. The clatter of metal echoed, sharp as thunder, but the camp remained still. "If we run, they follow," Wyatt murmured. "Then let them follow," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "We'll show them what strength really looks like." They moved fast, darting from shadow to shadow, slipping into the tree line beyond the fences. Ayanna darted ahead, her smaller frame clearing the path, while Wyatt, bruised but unbroken, kept close behind. Guiding them east toward a canyon he promised no cavalry would dare enter. By dawn, they reached the ravine. Its stone walls rose like sentinels, sheltering them in silence. Ayanna collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged, not from exhaustion but from the weight of everything she had cast off. "They'll call me a traitor," she murmured. The words stung like ash on her tongue. Wyatt crouched beside her, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her dirt-streaked face. "No," he said softly. "Only those afraid of truth use that word." They pressed onward. For 3 days they traveled, sleeping beneath rock outcroppings, eating what little Wyatt could catch in snares or with his rifle. Ayanna's feet blistered, her shoulders ached from the pack, but she never thought of turning back. Each step away from the outpost was a step away from every lie she had been told about worth and obedience. On the 4th morning, the land softened. They reached a hidden clearing, a crystal stream winding gently through grass and stone. There, bent over a small fire, sat an old woman. Her face was lined with years, her eyes sharp yet kind. She looked up as if she had been expecting them. Wyatt knelt beside her and spoke with a gentleness Ayanna had never heard in his voice. "My sister," he explained. "Once she was the healer of our family." The woman's gaze fell on Ayanna. No surprise flickered there, no judgment, only certainty. She reached out her weathered hand, her words low but clear in English. "You were not given," she said. "You were found." The fire's warmth wrapped around them that night, chasing away the bite of fear. Ayanna sat close to Wyatt, the silence between them no longer hollow but whole. She studied the curve of his profile, the way the firelight caught the scars along his cheek, the way his presence made the night less cruel. And she realized, with a clarity that stole her breath, something terrifying in its simplicity. She loved him, not out of gratitude, not out of desperation, but because in his silence and strength he had taught her a truth she had long been denied. That worth is not something others assign. Worth is something you claim, and something you refuse to surrender, no matter who tries to strip it from you. The cavalry didn't forget. Men like Captain Marsh never did. To him, defiance was a stain, and any native woman who did not tremble at his boots was defiance itself. To him, treason lay not in deeds but in posture. Any white man who refused to bow, who dared walk beside the so-called savages as equals, was guilty before he even opened his mouth. That was the law Marsh carried in his marrow, as sharp and cruel as the bayonet at his hip. 2 weeks passed before the reckoning came. 2 weeks of quiet in the hidden canyon, where the creek wound like silver thread, and the morning smelled of cedar smoke and wild mint. 2 weeks in which Ayanna almost let herself believe that the cavalry, the settlers, the cruel whispers of her people had all been left behind. But peace in the West was never a permanent guest. It was only ever a visitor, and always a fleeting one. She spotted them first from the ridge above the clearing. 5 riders on horseback, rifles glinting in the hard sunlight, their coats dark, their movements deliberate, the red dust rising around them like smoke. And there among them Luna, her arm bound in a sling, her mouth tight as thread, her young face pale and unreadable. Betrayal burned in Ayanna's chest like fire. She turned and ran down the slope, breath tearing at her lungs, dust rising from her boots. Wyatt and his sister were bent over a spread of herbs near the fire, grinding roots into powder, their movements slow and steady as if time itself answered to them. "They found us," Ayanna shouted, her voice cracking. 5 riders, maybe more behind them. Wyatt rose slowly, not in panic but with the tired readiness of a man who had always known peace could never last without being tested by violence. He brushed the dust from his knees and looked toward the ridge where the horses' shadows grew longer. "Go into the ravine," he told her, his voice calm, steady. "You and my sister. Hide in the stone nest until they pass." But Ayanna shook her head fiercely, her hand clutching his arm. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her eyes burning with fire that felt older than her body. "If they take you again, they'll have to shoot me too." For the first time since she had known him, his gaze faltered, and pain carved deeper lines in his face. He whispered, almost pleading, "You should not die for me." Her voice broke, but it was steady. "Then you never understood. I'm not dying for you. I'm living for what you taught me." The confrontation erupted just as the sun struck the clearing, a white blaze turning the soldiers into silhouettes of steel. Captain Marsh sat tall on his horse, his rifle raised like a gavel. His jaw was tight, his lips a thin, cruel line. Behind him, Luna's voice trembled, the words spilling weak but desperate. "Let the man go. We can still help him." Her voice was a thread in the wind, fragile and fraying. But before Wyatt could speak, Ayanna stepped forward. She raised her arms, her voice ringing across the clearing, louder than she had ever spoken in her life. "He's not your prisoner. He's my family." The words cracked like a whip, hanging in the air heavy as stone. Family, not bought, not bartered, not stolen. Claimed, chosen. The soldiers hesitated, their rifles wavering. For they saw in her not a trembling girl, but something vast and unyielding, a flame that had refused to be snuffed out. Wyatt stepped to her side then, his shoulders square, his head lifted, the quiet mountain of his presence rising behind her. No kiss had ever passed between them, no vows carved in church walls, but the truth of their bond needed no ceremony. It was carved into the marrow of their bodies, sanctified by fire and survival. "You don't get to decide who I belong to," Ayanna shouted, her voice breaking but firm. She stared directly at Marsh, the man who embodied every cage. "Not you, not my father, not your uniform. You gave me away because you thought I was worthless, and he gave me back my life because he saw more than a face." Silence, the kind that crackled louder than gunfire. From the back of the line, a younger soldier's voice broke the stillness. "Let him be, sir. They ain't hurting anyone." Luna's gaze dropped, shame flooding her young face. Marsh's jaw twitched, fury fighting against the edges of his control. He spat into the dust, the sound harsh and final. "This ain't over," he barked. Then with a tug of his reins, he wheeled his horse around. The others fell in behind him, rifles lowered but eyes burning with unfinished business. Only when the dust had cleared did Ayana's shoulders drop, the air returning to her lungs like water after drowning. She turned slowly toward Wyatt, her hand trembling as it reached for his. Their fingers clasped, not with desperation, but with the certainty of two people who had stood the world down and refused to break. The seasons turned. Spring melted into summer, summer into the crisp gold of autumn. With each sunrise in the hidden canyon, Ayana shed pieces of the girl she had been, the girl who flinched at mirrors, the girl who swallowed her voice until silence devoured her, the girl who thought love was earned only by pleasing cruel men. Under Wyatt's quiet steadiness and his sister's gentle wisdom, Ayana's body and spirit found new shape. She learned to heal with herbs, to weave nets fine enough to catch trout in the stream, to track elk by broken twigs and bent grass, to read the whispers of the wind, not because survival demanded it, but because for the first time she wanted to belong. And belonging here did not mean changing who she was, it meant recognizing what had always lived inside her: strength, defiance, and a hunger for freedom too wild to cage. She and Wyatt never spoke of marriage. No ceremony was needed. Instead, they planted corn together in the dark soil by the creek. They shared stories beside the fire, their laughter mingling with the crackle of flame. And when Ayana's hand touched his face rough with stubble, scarred by years of battles, it was not with the fear of losing him, but with the reverence of someone who had found home. One afternoon she caught her reflection in the creek. Her cheeks were sunburned, her hands calloused, her hair tangled and wild from the wind. For the first time, she didn't look away. She saw not the cursed stormbringer her people had named her, but a woman alive with fire, a woman carved from loss, yet made whole again. Travelers passed through now and then, Navajo cousins carrying stories, traders with weary horses, even a lone priest who nodded politely and asked no questions. Whispers of their defiance spread like seeds scattered on the wind. Some called her mad, others brave. Some said a legend was being born in that canyon, a tale of a woman who had stood against soldiers and claimed her freedom. But Ayana no longer cared what the world called her. She hadn't chosen Wyatt to prove herself to others. She had chosen him because in his arms she had found the rarest truth of all: love without conditions. When word reached her that her father had died, unmourned, bitter, alone, Ayana felt no triumph, no vengeance, no joy, only release. Like the final sigh of pain leaving the body at last, she marked the day not with grief but with creation. She planted wildflowers along the stream, their roots finding hold in the dark soil, not for him, for herself, for the girl she had been, the one he had tried and failed to break. She whispered a prayer into the wind, not of forgiveness, but of survival. As the petals danced in the evening light, Wyatt came behind her, his hands warm as he wrapped the same wool blanket around her shoulders that he had once offered by the fire that first night. His breath was steady against her ear as he whispered, "No one will ever give you away again." She leaned into him, eyes closed, the steady drum of his heart grounding her. She smiled not because all wounds had healed, but because the ones that mattered had grown back stronger, rooted in soil watered by love. Above them, the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of fire and violet. Two silhouettes stood together at the canyon's edge, neither fugitives nor outcasts anymore, but partners, bound not by rope or barter, but by choice. Their story was not carved in stone, nor sung in chants. It was lived in each step, each fire shared, each breath against the harsh wind, a testament whispered across the plains, that even in the most brutal lands, love can bloom. Ayana knew it now. The cowboy love stories told in saloons and whispered around campfires were full of gunfights and vengeance, of horses running against the horizon. But the truest Wild West love story lived in the quiet moments, fingers clasped in silence, laughter breaking through grief, a future unwritten but shared. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health, with hope, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. So tell me, do you believe that even in the darkest times, there's a miracle waiting at the end of the road? If deep down you still believe God is watching over you, arranging everything in silence, then right now, leave a comment AMEN below this story. Who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may already be finding its way into your life.